My name is Ivona Piurko. I'm European Union Ambassador to Singapore, and I'm very happy to be today at our event on CBAM. Today we are meeting to talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism and the importance of it for decarbonisation all over the planet, and especially among such like-minded partners as Singapore and European Union. We are like-minded partners in many areas of cooperation. This week we are celebrating 4th year of our free trade agreement, which is being implemented with a lot of success on both sides.
I think we need to dispel some of the myths that let's say, underline the dialogue about the green policies of the EU. We have to show that CBAM is a very down-to-earth, very linked to business instrument. It gives incentives to business to decarbonize their production, and therefore it's very much linked to sustainability objectives that we all have internationally, locally and regionally. Singapore is a country that has a carbon pricing system very similar to the one that we have in EU, so we are looking to partner with Singapore to export the carbon pricing in the whole region, and we are looking at standardization and verification bodies to work together with the industries in the region to make sure that in these sectors, steel and aluminium, where more of the trade in this region exists, that we have a good implementation.
Dear Excellencies, dear Director General Thomas, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you at today's events, focusing on understanding of our European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or in short, indeed, CBAM. As we in the European Union raise our own climate ambition, and as long as less stringent climate policies prevail in some parts of the world, there is a risk of carbon leakage. The CBAM is the European Union landmark tool to put a fair price on the carbon emitted during the production of carbon-intensive goods that are entering the European Union, and to encourage cleaner industrial production all over the world. Today's event provides us the perfect platform to zoom in on the various aspects of the mechanism, and I know there is a lot of interest for them in Singapore and the region, and on their potential impact on the businesses in Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries. When we first started to contemplate about the organization of this event earlier this year, and I thank my team for their work on this, we were not sure when and how we will be able to secure in presence attendance for our event, as really the whole world is interested in this very new policy. So I am really thrilled to welcome with us today Mr. Thomas, Director General of Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union in the European Commission, and his team. He is touring Asia, actually, as part of a broader outreach activity, and has just visited Republic of Korea, Japan, China, and today he's in Singapore with us. You will be therefore able to hear really firsthand from our esteemed guest on the objectives of the CBAM, which is now in transitional phase. We will also be joined by experts from private sector, academia, who will be talking during the two panels as just mentioned. Let me use this opportunity to thank our implementing partner, EU-ASEAN Business Council, for organizing this event with us, and Eurocham Singapore for their support, and last but not least, GOPA for their overall coordination of the preparations. I wish you a fruitful event and above all interesting discussions. Thank you very much for finding time for this important subject. And without further ado, let's go into the subject. Thank you very much.
In recent years, natural disasters in Southeastern Asia and the EU have made our citizens acutely aware of climate change's devastating effects. Fighting their drivers requires bold and decisive action by all of us, citizens, industry, governments. The close relationship between the European Union and Singapore is crucial for accelerating climate ambitions in the world. Singapore and the EU are jointly working bilaterally and multilaterally to increase the world's climate ambitions. Both the EU and Singapore have set as an objective to reach climate neutrality by 2050. We are also both active members of international fora that fight for these objectives. The OECD Inclusive Forum for Climate Mitigation Approaches. We also work on the Climate Club, and we work together in all multilateral fora under the UN and the OECD. Our presence today testifies of our level of engagement with you, directly with your government and the business community. And we want to inform you about the instruments that we use in the fight for climate change, including the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Let me first underline some key elements that I believe are important to keep in mind for the exchanges. First of all, CBAM is a climate measure, an internal part of a package of measures that will allow EU to present a revised national determined contribution and ambitious plan in COP 2028 in Dubai starting next week. The objective of carbon neutrality by 2050 is now legally binding within the EU in the form of EU climate law that was adopted in 2021. To deliver on this legally binding commitment, we have adopted a large number of laws modifying the energy and climate policies that we had in Europe and in our member states, precisely to make sure that we achieve the emission reduction of 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 emissions level. Our commitment compares to 1990, a quite, let's say, ambitious level going back quite some years. As part of this legislation, we have increased our targets for the use of renewable energy and targets for energy efficiency, and we argue, in COP, we will argue that this is a necessity for all countries to triple their commitment and introduction of renewable energies and double our targets for energy efficiency. This is our general approach for COP 2028. And beyond that, we have adopted a lot of measures, including standards for car emissions, different regulatory and market-based standards. Last but not least, we have committed to deal with the difficult issue of energy-intensive industries. It's a narrow sector, but it is a sector of the economy that it is polluting a lot, and it has not achieved as much results as we would have liked over the last years, among others because of the lack of technologies. A key policy to achieve this decarbonization that we are seeking is carbon pricing, and we have a very developed emission trading system in the EU covering more than 40% of the EU's economy. The sectors covered by EU, they have already achieved a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 37% since 2005 that the system was introduced. Now, we decided last year to reinforce the carbon pricing system. We have introduced a set of conditions to gradually reduce the cap on emissions. Our ETS system is a cap and trade system, so we cap the emissions and then we trade within them. So we have, in last year, we adopted a very important reform of our cap. When in the beginning of this decade, in 2020, we had an objective to reduce, let's say, the available allowances by 2.2% per year. We have doubled now this to 4.4 per year. So we have increased the speed by which we reduce the available allowances. And on top of that, we have introduced an additional rebasing, a structural reduction, by removing from the system 90 megatons in 2024, 27 megatons in 2026. So overall, we are taking through these two-step adjustments away about 1/6 of the free allowances in one go. in addition to the 4.4 annual reduction. As a result of this, it is expected that our prices will increase, and therefore the carbon leakage risks will increase dramatically. That's what we expect. And just for the avoidance of doubt, carbon leakage, when we talk about leakage, we mean two things. Either the fact that the decarbonisation requirements will push companies to move outside the EU, or products will be replaced by with more carbon intensive products. So far we have mitigated this risk with let's say, free allowances, but as we move them out, I think we take additional measures to make sure that in the area where the EU is a net importer, in the energy intensive industries, the EU is a net importer, that we manage to have a system by which we import sustainable green products and we don't import unsustainable products. This is done in a way that it is fully compliant with the WTO and international trade rules, and that's why we have an important engagement at the WTO and internationally through the OECD to make sure that we have the instrument is developed with the right components. Now, a key aspect of the design of our instrument is the gradual introduction. We have a transition period that started this year, to be precise, on the 1st of October of this year, and it gets us all the way to the end of 2025. We adopted this regulation on the 17th of August, the transition regulation, and this will take us, these provisional arrangements will take us forward until the end of 2025, and the definite, what we call the definite CBAM regime will enter into force in the 1st of January 2026. This transition period with reporting requirements will allow us to gather information from the industry on the supply chains, on the emissions that are generated, where they are generated, how they are generated. So we will take this into account along with the input that we get from our bilateral dialogues with governments and the input that we get from the multilateral engagements over the next 3 years in order to come to the final CBAM methodology in 2026. Some of you are saying, we don't know all the details. Precisely this is the point. If we design the details and impose them on you, then we will make mistakes in this complicated matter. This is a period for dialogue and getting the input, and already the methodologies that we developed for the transition, we developed them in the open way. We had an expert group with participating third countries, and a lot of the comments that third countries made or producers made already were incorporated. So we have demonstrated to our partners that we are getting their input in order to have an instrument that it is fit for purpose. Now, what our dialogue with the industry and the countries concentrates on making sure that we look at the synergies that we can have with other national, regional, or international reporting commitments. So we have a certain request for information, and we see how they fit together with similar regulatorily on other commitments. And the second issue that we are trying to do is to make sure on achieving the maximum possible simplification. So some of them you will observe that our reporting through the transition period is quarterly. Every quarter we receive some information. And this, for some partners, to be fair, was surprising. I want, however, to say that our definite regime, in 2026, our reporting is annual, the same that we have in the EU, and this quarterly reporting requirement has to be seen against two against the background of two issues. The first is we wanted to maximize the input that we have from the trading partners and the trading companies. So if we had annual observations, we would have one observation until we revised the methodology, while now we have multiple observations, and this allows us to better design the next instrument. The second is that in the transition period, there are no effects and there is a lot of flexibility. I mean, it is true that the CBAM entered into effect on the 1st of October 2023, but until the end of next year, there is flexibility when information is not available to provide default values or equivalent values. There are no financial consequences for reporting default or equivalent values, and there are specific provisions who make the reporting by SMEs very easy, or exclude the reporting of small companies or any company in the supply chain that is generating less than 20% of the emissions. So there is a lot of scope in the supply chain for one company to take advantage of the reporting of the other one. So we do have an overall commitment to co-design. We have an overall commitment to ensure that we have the best methodology for calculating embedded emissions and getting the input from the private sector. We do have a commitment to find the best possible simplification. Now, some of our partners do not worry about the current sectors. As you know, we have steel, aluminum, cement, and fertilizers. Here in Singapore, very little trade in all of them. We have also electricity and hydrogen. Electricity is concentrated for flows across the border of the EU, far away from here, and hydrogen trade has not yet started. So we have these four sectors, but a number of you wonder about the expansion of the scope. We have in our legislation that before 2026 we will announce whether we will extend the scope. We will take stock of the implementation. We will make a report in the mid of 2025 on how we will deal with scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and look at the energy intensive industries. It is important to understand and focus that what is energy intensive industry, it's well defined in European legislation. There are many sectors that in the literature could be covered by carbon measures, but not in our regulation. So in practice, beyond these four sectors, the only the sector that it is going to be analyzed for possible inclusion, partly or wholly, is petrochemicals and chemicals. There is no, we have countries worry about textiles or about agricultural products. They are not in the scope of energy intensive industries as defined. And even the sectors like chemicals or petrochemicals, there are specific criteria that will guide our final choice. So they will not be fully covered, but most probably partially covered. So I think it is important to concentrate our future thinking to what is really in the scope, not in a general way. Now, last point I want to make is that CBAM, when it enters into force in the definite regime, it will look at the carbon content of the different products that are exported to the EU, but it will also take into account and deduct from any obligations on the carbon pricing or carbon taxes that are paid locally. So in the case of Singapore, you have a carbon tax that it is pioneering for the region, and other Asian countries have announced plans to include, to have carbon pricing. Indonesia is one. Others are studying the possibility. For us, the system that we have in Singapore is closer to the ones that we have in Europe. You cover a large part of the greenhouse gas emissions, 80% in the case of Singapore, and you have a path going forward to increase the carbon tax rate. And I think this is very important to us because it shows that the government in Singapore works with a similar mix of instruments to achieve the carbon emissions and to believe that you are a pioneer in the region, and we would like to support you in remaining so. So this is the real objective of what we try to do on CBAM. In one of the meetings that I had this morning, in one of the meetings, it was described as the political economy objective. It is getting other countries to adopt carbon pricing systems. Some think that CBAM was designed to generate budgetary revenues. This is not the case. The whole design is to give incentives to industry to decarbonize. Even after 2026, and we will have financial implications, that's to give you a perception of the numbers involved. We import at the moment in the EU about 156 billion worth of products in these four sectors, 156 billions per year. And the estimations is that as a maximum we will in 2030, so after the first 5 years of carbon introduction of the CBAM introduction, as CBAM enters into force, we will have a revenue less than 2 billion euros. So the objective is not revenue generation. The objective is to have an incentive for companies to decarbonize. Now, what does it involve? The trade here in the region with Singapore and in the region is not so big. If we take the steel sector, we have an annual import of 76 million tons per year of steel in the EU. 8.8 million come from Canada, 14.5 come from Ukraine and Turkey, the neighborhood countries. So overall, let's say more than close to 1/3 of the imports of steel come from these countries. If we look, in the region, we import, let's say, close to nothing from Singapore, 2 million tons from Vietnam, less than 1 million from Indonesia, very little from Thailand. So going forward, however, we see that our base of imports is modified. I mean, the Russian war, a lot of the imports of steel and aluminum and fertilizers came from Russia. For example, in fertilizers, we already minimized to zero our imports from Russia, and these imports have shifted to countries like Morocco, Egypt, Jordan. So there is a potential, as we will remain a net importer in this area, we have a possibility for many countries to increase their exports in these energy-intensive products to Europe. And I think it is important to keep the overall numbers in mind, and not only the actual level of exports that you have today, but the dynamic of the market. So we believe overall that it is important to discuss these issues with you. Here in Singapore, businesses based in Singapore, we think that the fact that you are facing a carbon price here, it makes you more familiar on the dynamic of our instruments. The government also has similar objectives and uses a similar mixture of instruments. And I think Singaporean businesses or consultants or researchers can play an important role in helping the sectors. I think we envisage that both as verifiers of emissions and as exporters dealing with procedures, businesses in Singapore will find good partnerships and try to work with us in this measure that has a clear environmental objective on how to decarbonize these energy-intensive industries. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our delegation. I want to thank all of you that have been actively participating. I have seen that there have been other workshops, other conferences. It is important to get your feedback here. We will listen to it, and we will have in the mid-2025, when we finalize the design, we will get your input into account. From what I have heard today and my previous stops in 3 other capitals over the last week, 90% of what we hear, it is possible for us to integrate and therefore facilitate the reporting and the engagement with you to have an instrument that really has an impact on the businesses. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. I have the joy of moderating this first panel this afternoon after the DG just giving us a very comprehensive overview of what CBAM is and what CBAM isn't and the direction of travel on it as well. I have experts on my panel here. I will keep Martin to the end, I think. And my first question will come to you, ladies. We just heard there what CBAM is, what it's going to be. I know there's quite a lot of concern, maybe anxiety here in Southeast Asia about what it means for the region. I'd like to get your views, please, on how it's being perceived and what you think the actual impacts will be on ASEAN companies and ASEAN countries. Start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. As before, we understand about the importance of CBAM, and then what is it? So now we are wondering what is exactly then the implication to the developing countries such as ASEAN. When we're talking about economics, there always a economic impact on that. So of course, first we can see there is a like a potential cost for the implementation of CBAM, of course, because of the of produced goods that's emitting with that. Emitted a lot of emissions, and then there's also a potential decrease in the industrial competitions here, especially for ASEAN countries that will compete with other countries that has more stringent climate policies, as well as or simply that they have more efficient in terms of producing their goods in managing their carbon emission. So we have that challenges, but then in my point of view, there's also a lot of opportunities in here. As we know in the ASEAN itself, based on the ASEAN energy, the 7th ASEAN Energy Outlook, we will see there is a projection of the region to have 4 times green gas emission in 2050 compared to its green gas house emission in 2020. And this depicts challenges. Meanwhile, the region itself, almost all of the countries already committed to net zero or carbon neutrality in 2050 and mid-centuries. And also based on the same report, the 7th ASEAN Energy Outlook that the ASEAN Center for Energy produced, by the way, there's an opportunity of these reducing emission based on the regional target and based on the regional climate target in there. And meanwhile, there's a lot of gaps that need to be addressed in order to have these potential emission reduction. And I think that's where CBAM can come into play, where it gives, where it can enable and also kind of catalyze the use like more stringent climate policies, and also catalyze the implementation of more renewable energy in the region. I think that's from me. Thank you.
Dr. Kim, let me ask you, I mean, what can ASEAN countries do to ameliorate the impacts of CBAM upon them and their businesses? We just heard, the region has targets for dealing with decarbonisation, getting to to net zero carbon. Some of them actually are quite a long way out, 2060 in a couple of the cases. So what can the region do to ameliorate the impact of CBAM on their businesses, to the extent there is an impact on them? And do you think CBAM would encourage faster movement towards decarbonisation?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a little bit challenging to discuss the Southeast Asian, the whole regional impact, because Southeast Asian countries varies in its economics, the development status. And so also the economic burden or impact of CBAM on individual Southeast Asian countries will be different. But but I believe in terms of the impact of the CBAM, probably the short term, the first impression would be economic burden or economic pressure on individual Southeast Asian countries. But in the midterm or long term, such an economic pressure will need or will require the Southeast Asian countries to reshape or restructure their exporting sector and exporting sector structure, and then also their energy-intensive industry structure. So in the midterm, to deal with CBAM effectively, all Southeast Asian countries' government and then business will make an effort together to decarbonize their economy and then their industrial sector, and then also improve their energy efficiency, especially because CBAM is basically for energy-intensive industry. So probably their prominent way to decarbonize their sector is increasing its energy efficiency. So I think for the ASEAN countries' government, probably it will also a little bit different, probably from the experience of some developed countries in Northeast Asian countries, the Japan and South Korea. They started to expand their RD&D, the research and development and demonstration projects. Their government support, they expand to government support and that kind of RD&D project and the EU CBAM regulated sector. But in Southeast Asian countries, probably some developed level countries like Singapore, probably they can follow developed economy strategies for more like supporting RD&D projects and then technology development or something like that. But for some less developed countries, developing countries, they can start it from more some subsidy like policy instrument for their exporting sector, but they can be just shifting from the subsidy one to more like supporting green finance, and then also the technology development and the technology diffusion, technology transfer from other developed economies to developing countries.
Would it actually help the region if more countries introduced a carbon pricing mechanism or a carbon tax?
Yeah, definitely. The carbon pricing will be helpful because the carbon pricing will be connected to the CBAM's price levy. So in Singapore, but in Southeast Asian countries, only Singapore has a carbon tax now, and then just Indonesia launched their ETS only for the coal-fired power generation sector this year. And then even though the Singapore has carbon pricing now, the carbon tax rate is still low, the $5 per ton of CO2 now, but it will be increased up to $50 to $80 by 2030. Nevertheless, it is still lower level compared to EU ETS level. So, so if the countries has already the carbon pricing scheme, probably they will consider more tighten their price level. And then for countries who does not have carbon pricing yet, they are considering introducing their own national carbon pricing schemes, such as the Thailand And also the Vietnam started to discuss their introduction of ETS, and then Thailand, the government is proposing carbon tax.
Thank you. Martin, we'll turn to you. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning there has been some concern, anxiety in this part of the world about CBAM and other aspects of EU policy as well. The DG said you believe it's WTO compliant. Perhaps you could just explain more about why you believe it is compliant and how you might approach alleviating some of those concerns amongst trading partners.
Yes, I mean, we believe it because our trade lawyers tell us so, that it's WTO compliant. But to explain a bit maybe, what we do there is, I mean, first of all, and I repeat this because it's a very important point that the DG made, CBAM is not a trade measure, not at all. It's a climate measure, and it has a very specific objective, which is contributing to the global action against climate change. And specifically what we do with CBAM is nothing less than trying to create a system in which products that are destined for the EU market are exposed to the same climate policy as it concerns carbon pricing. And no product that has been produced abroad, that is exported into the Union, will face stricter conditions or will face higher prices than those that are produced in the Union. So we have no worse treatment of third country producers than EU producers. And in that respect, we are convinced that it's WTO compliant. As it concerns alleviating the concerns, I mean, what we will do is, and this is part of our strategy in alleviating the concerns, is going out in the world and explaining the measure in detail, because many of the concerns are unfounded, coming from maybe misreporting, maybe misunderstandings related to the proposal or to the law, as it concerns, for instance, the impact for this region. It's at the moment. At the moment it's non-existent because the CBAM is not yet in place, but even from 2026 onwards in the current shape, the impact will be marginal at best, because the sectors to which CBAM applies are not sectors in which there is a lot of trade between the countries in this region and the EU. But also there will be an outreach in terms of these kind of engagement with stakeholders, but also with governments in bilateral discussions. We have now been speaking with China, with Korea, with Japan, Singapore, but also in multilateral discussions. I mean, the Director General mentioned the OECD, but we also speak as a WTO. So obviously, we are convinced, and we are that the measure is in its current shape WTO compliant, but it may require more explanation and also maybe some caveats on, or some qualification on what we actually intend for it to develop into, because there are also all these rumors. Maybe we come to the extension of the scope, but what it is and what it will be is much smaller than the branding that it got by being the first instrument of such kind in the world. It's very attractive to speak about it because everyone is curious about the new thing, the new kid in town. But it's indeed a kid and not a grown-up, and it will probably never become the grown-up that will change so much the world, because it's only one little piece that is contributing to our global effort to challenge climate change.
So you touched upon there some of the concerns that people have about the direction of travel on CBAM. A lot of companies are going to start worrying very quickly about the cost of compliance, the cost of reporting on it, especially when you add in other measures coming out from other governments and indeed from Brussels as well. To what extent are you using this current period to try and test bed ideas around compliance, get feedback from industry, feedback from governments about how to make the process work better and smarter?
So indeed, I mean, we have the next 2 years, which is, as you know, is a pure reporting and a pilot phase in which we get the reporting, actually more reporting to get good information, on which basis we will be able to calibrate very well the mechanism from 2026 onwards. And we want to ask as little information as we need to assess the embedded emissions and the associated CBAM charge, because the reduction of administrative costs is one of the core design objectives that we already have in there. But as it's the first CBAM, the first in the world, it is inevitable that there will be some flaws in the initial design. So this period is now, we speak to business across the world inside the union, because it's the importers in the union that will have to report actually. So the obligations fall on them to understand if there are maybe ways of adapting the reporting requirements in the way that give us the same or better information with as little cost in terms of administrative compliance as possible.
So Adil, I'll come to you and pick up further on that point. I mean, the designing and implementation of something like CBAM, maybe in the future other countries coming up with their own carbon border mechanisms as well. How, in your view, how can we make sure that the administrative burden on companies is kept to the minimum while still encouraging them to decarbonise at the same time?
Thank you, Chris, for the question. Yeah, but as Martin mentioned, for these reporting to CBAM itself, there's a transitional phases in here where the companies has been times to actually understand what is the impact of this, what could they can report what are the goods that they are imported to the EU, and then what are the what are the calculation of the carbon emission itself, and in that sense, I think from the EU itself, please correct me if I'm mistaken in here, we understand that the EU have give the kind of like a report on this, and even have a tools for these, how to calculate for this report itself, as well as giving the material for trainings for this reporting. So I'm sure these are one of the things that can help us preparing for these, how to actually reporting this until it comes into effect on the 2026. And I think from us as well, not only in that sense, in how the report come about, but I think from companies will also need to understand what is the, or to establish guidelines for them in order to, for data inventory, for example. I think that is important measures for this. And also, I think one of the things, because CBAM can be a gray area, so sometimes you might not sure which department that will handle this actually. Will it be in the ESG department, or will it be tax department that will handle all of these administrative reporting? I think these things can also be a discussion, maybe later in the second panel, I believe. But I think these are the things that we need to prepare for these administrative report that need to do with CBAM. Thank you.
I suspect in many companies it's a hot potato and they're trying to throw it from department to department. Dr. Kim.
Yeah, maybe I can add just some points. In Asian countries, I think if they have already the carbon pricing scheme, ETS or carbon tax, either one, their reporting system will be partly similar to EU CBAM reporting. So they have already some experiences about that. For those governments, they have some experience to they communicate to the companies and then also the educate companies about that, their reporting requirement. And then also in those countries, there are some verifiers and then the third party, the reviewers and the verifiers, they have also the capacity to review their the companies' reporting. So in that case, probably more like countries can share their experiences and knowledge to the less developed Southeast Asian countries. And then also at the regional level, probably establishing some regional hub for dealing with the CBAM will be an option, because they will collectively make an effort for capacity building for SMEs in Southeast Asian region. Yeah.
So we heard the DG mention earlier that the prime objective behind CBAM is not revenue raising for the EU. It is actually to encourage decarbonisation. I think here in Southeast Asia, the countries most likely to be impacted at the moment are probably Vietnam and Indonesia, based on what's in scope and what the exports are. Do you actually think it will encourage them to accelerate in decarbonisation?
Who knows? But I think at least in the midterm, yes, because they still want to maintain their market access, and then they are kind of some competitiveness, and then also they want to maintain their GDP level, and then also the export volume. So in that case, they have to follow kind of the global trend, and then also the CBAM is not. Actually, one of the concerns of the Southeast Asian countries is that EU will not be only the entity to implement the CBAM, because more countries like United States, Canada, UK, and then some countries are also considering adoption or implementation of their own CBAM. So in that case, probably the carbon border adjustment and then carbon pricing will be kind of the global trend. In that case, the individual countries in Southeastern region, they have no choice besides the following the adopting the carbon pricing. So I think in the midterm and the long term, yes, they will accelerate their decarbonization effort.
So you see a world, you both might see a world, Martin might want to see a world as well, where we don't just see a CBAM from Europe, we see equivalents, probably some other fancy acronyms spreading around the world. Is that right? You see the US, you see the UK, you see Canada, maybe Korea, Japan at some point bringing in their own mechanisms?
We are not sure about some Asian countries, but we are just talking with that countries who has already some kind of semi-official announcement of they are considering, and then they are studying the feasibility of their own CBAM. Yeah.
So Martin, I'll come to you on a very related point. I mean, to what extent you're having these discussions you mentioned earlier in multilateral fora? To what extent is the EU actually working with other countries on trying to expand CBAM? I'm trying to make sure in doing so that we don't end up with companies just moving their production lines to avoid getting hit by it. You know, that's the carbon leakage issue.
I wouldn't think that expanding CBAM is the starting point, because CBAM is sort of, well, an expansion of or an extension of a carbon pricing system, but it's indeed sort of the external arm, if you want. So the starting point for our exchanges is, or I would say, is discussions on carbon pricing, on supporting our partners who have not yet introduced carbon pricing mechanisms in doing so. And even further, because CBAM is an agnostic instrument, CBAM is assessing the carbon content in the imported goods irrespective of the policy measures that have driven this decarbonization. So we are supporting our partners in any way that they would pursue decarbonization policies. But of course, there is, we as a union have selected as a key instrument in the decarbonization policy a carbon pricing instrument. We are convinced that a market-based instrument like the ETS, but could also be a carbon tax, that's both are very, very efficient instruments with certain disadvantages. It's more efficient to drive decarbonization in that way together with the industry, with businesses, instead of regulation only. And in that sense, of course, the next step is then how can we create carbon pricing systems that are somewhat compatible? Is there potentially scope? That means using a similar or same methodology for calculating the embedded emissions, so to make the carbon price, the effective carbon price comparable? What about, their discussion at the WTO, which we are supportive of a carbon price floor, maybe as a first step to a global carbon price. All these things, of course, we support. We would, of course, we have also now, we are in discussions with the UK, who are considering, they have a very similar ETS system, and therefore it's a natural consideration of them, and I think they are now preparing legislation to move to a CBAM. And as long as we are in that stage where it's individual jurisdictions and countries implementing CBAMs, and we don't have this kind of club situation where there are many countries with the same carbon price, it's helpful for businesses if these carbon border measures are similar in their design, because that would limit, of course, the administrative burden, the reporting requirements. But that, again, comes back to, and you mentioned that as well, to the carbon pricing systems themselves. If we manage to use similar or same methodologies, that will reduce massively the reporting, the administrative costs related to reporting, because what you do for your national system is then also applicable to the exports that you send into jurisdictions that have a border adjustment measure. And in that sense, I think the focus will be in the discussions also at the OECD on the methodology for embedded emissions above all, because if we manage to align there, I think then we make a big step forward. And that's then also relevant for countries like the US, who are not yet at least ready for market-based measures like ETS or tax, because the methodology for calculating embedded emissions is also relevant if you are following a more standard regulatory approach.
This is one of the problems that industry is most worried about, is that we end up with different regimes, similar looking, but different regimes with different reporting requirements. And we already see it in things like taxonomies in the world for green finance. We'll see it with ESG reporting in different stock exchanges as well. What can the Commission do? And you're leading the world on this particular, what can you do to try and help make sure that we don't end up with a plethora of different reporting requirements, which is going to overburden industry?
I think we do two things. First of all, what we do now, we have this transitional period where we say this is a sort of a pilot, a draft, and let's engage on the basis of this. But we don't say this is now we discussed earlier, and you mentioned maybe it's not ideal that we don't have certainty, legal certainty, clarity for business for the next 10 years, and I take this point. But at the same time, we need to give some time to have a discussion with business and third countries. Is that really the best way of defining the methodology? And so we have now our proposal, a crude draft out there. On the basis we will discuss and fine-tune, and only in 2025 we will then set in stone what we will find applicable for CBAM in 2026 onwards. And at the same time, we use various tracks, and then the most important, I suppose, is the one at the OECD Inclusive Forum for Climate Mitigation Approaches, which has a specific module on the methodology for calculating carbon emissions. And we are there, we are actively there, we use our approach and bring it to the table, and there we will listen and discuss with our partners and try to come up over time, and the timeline is for a first report end of next year, try to come up with something which is agreeable and a sort of a common denominator with other partners as well. And then we'll see on that basis whether we think we need to adapt our legislation in 2025 to accommodate certain requests that we get from partners and businesses alike.
Adil, I'll come to you next. Looking at this part of the world, what do you see as some of the opportunities, perhaps, that the ASEAN member states can take from something like CBAM? Do you see ASEAN perhaps trying to work collectively on something similar for itself, to try and understand it? Or do you think they're just going to carry on with their head in the sand?
I think in that sense, like I mentioned previously before, that these CBAM can be catalysts in a way that creating or like to support or to push the climate policies in ASEAN itself to be more stringent. But then to be able to do that, I think not only the region need to work together, the region already has their regional climate target. And then, of course, now if we look at the trajectory, how it's still hasn't yet near the target that the region want to achieve. I think this is where the region has to work together to achieve that. But in order to do that, not only the region that needs to work together on that, but there's also need some kind of a complementing policies, I think, in a way that, for example, with CBAM itself, perhaps there's a need of there's opportunity for trade facilitation, for example, and then technology transfer that that can be funded by the revenue from CBAM itself. So what I mean in here, there's also need a commitment from the EU to kind of like share the burden of decarbonization with the developing countries. I think then that will be can also an opportunity for the region to move forward.
To be a bit fair to the EU, they do have a number of programs in place designed to try and help ASEAN, particularly on things like energy transition going forward. Dr. Kim, do you just agree with what Adila was saying, or do you think ASEAN has got other opportunities it can pursue here?
I'm sorry.
Do you agree with what Adila was saying?
Yes, I generally agree. The ASEAN, in the short term, I think the challenge will be bigger than opportunity, but always the private sector and the industry used that kind of the challenges and then hard time, difficult times, the shift, used that time for their advancement and then kind of their development and then their shift to their opportunities. So I think CBAM will be the similar for the Southeast Asian government and then business sector together.
We'll come to the audience with some questions in a moment, so please start thinking. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes, and there will be some roving mics. Martin, I've got an unfair question for you. It's not a revenue-raising objective, but it will raise revenues. Is the idea to use some of that money to help partners with compliance and green themselves, or will that just go to the general kitty in the Commission?
I have several answers to this. The first one is a bit of a legal one. It's simply we cannot earmark in the budgetary process revenue for specific purposes, and therefore I think it's called universality of the budget. But I think the more pragmatic answer is the 2 billion that we may get in 2030 from CBAM are very from all the rest of the world, and notably from countries that are not least developed countries, are nothing compared to the 70 billion that we spend annually on support to external aid. I mean, if we do this trade and say let's focus on the CBAM money and give that out, I think it's not the best deal for our international partners. But of course, that is the plan is and was and continues to be that we help third countries, our international partners, notably less developed countries, developing countries, in their ambition to transition into a more sustainable economy. I mean, it cannot be different, and it's a key and central pillar of our external aid policy. I think it's half or whatever, 40% of our external aid goes into the green transition. And that is irrespective of the money that we get from CBAM in 7 years. We do that now, and because this is the only way of us collectively achieving the climate targets that we have for 2050.
Okay, thank you. Right, it's Q&A time from our audience, and I see Bob with his hand up, so we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating topics and questions. I'm visiting from Eurochan, Thailand. CBAM is a disincentive. It's like a stick rather than a carrot. It disincentivizes companies to keep doing and producing carbon by having a tax. An example in Thailand is not long ago they brought in a policy for medical tourism and or recreational tourism for cannabis use. Who knows what the real policy is, but it's there. There's another part of the cannabis plant, the stalk, which can be used for building materials. And in fact, it's becoming a big business in Australia and the US. What about the carrot side? What about, instead of just taxing, what about giving grants, matching grants, incentives to companies to explore cement alternatives or any one of the other alternatives in a list of products that I mentioned? Taxing authorities around the world have found that it's overall more efficient sometimes to not keep taxing, but to give grants and incentives. Different department, maybe, but a possibility. What do you think the future holds for the carrot side rather than just the stick side? Thank you.
Okay, I think, Martin, that's really directed to you, but please, you both feel free to chip in. It's not a tax, by the way. It's a mechanism. Because if it was a tax, it wouldn't be compliant.
Absolutely, it's not a tax. But I would say we do that already. It is, I mean, if you look at, I mean, again, CBAM is just one small piece in a big policy package of measures driving the decarbonisation in the Union. And we have, as part of this policy package, some instruments like standards, efficiency standards and so on, then market-based pricing tools, which indeed are, if you say, I mean, I could put it like incentivizing more sustainable production, but of course it is putting a cost to non-sustainable production processes. So I see that point, but of course they are also part of this policy mix is support into innovation and research development and into more greener production processes in the Union and abroad. So we already have, as part of this policy mix, the carrot, and I believe we will continue to have that part in, because it's the most, we need a balanced approach. That is our conviction as the Commission, and we will pursue this also going forward. So I mean, I cannot now, because it's not necessarily my department, name you specific numbers, but it's clearly so that we whether it's tax credits in the corporate tax world, but that's more for national member states, or direct grants or other form of support for R&D, that's already part of the policy mix, and it should be.
Maybe I can share other countries' experience. It's not directly related to CBAM, but I think byproduct of CBAM, probably we expect the several countries will adopt their own carbon pricing. So regardless of the form of carbon pricing, ETS or carbon tax, for most of the countries has used their revenue from the carbon tax and then also revenue from the auction of the ETS allowances. They allocated that kind of revenue to investing in the corporate side, the green project, and then and the energy efficiency project, and then renewable energy deployment, something like that. And in other words, another side, some countries make their carbon tax scheme kind of revenue neutral. So even though they collect some revenues from the carbon tax, in that case they have some complementary mechanism to discount some corporate income tax or something like that. So not only for CBAM, but just more in a broader sense, and carbon pricing scheme design, I think there are sticks and carrots together in most of the countries. So probably for a CBAM, I don't know the EU's decision, but if some of Southeast Asian countries will adopt the carbon pricing, their own national carbon pricing, probably the governments will consider and then think of how to use the carbon tax or ETS revenue for their industrial sector.
But I look across the region here, and whilst I see some policy changes and regulatory changes, I don't see too many carrots being issued. And that in some places like Indonesia, where PLN actively work against having renewable energy. I see the opposite happening. Do you actually, am I incorrect? Do you think I'm wrong, or do you think there are some carrots in the region?
They still have fossil fuel subsidies, the massive amount of fossil fuel subsidies. But in addition to that, another factor is that anyway, the fossil fuel subsidies are showing some decreasing trend. Yeah, so that's kind of the one good news and the positive news. Yeah, but still, it's also true that they still have huge amount of the fossil fuel. But just we are expecting probably it will take some time, but they will continually and then just steadily decrease that kind of the subsidies that are not good for kind of decarbonization.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Lady at the back. On the left, please, Jen.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. I'm from Global Counsel, a public policy consulting firm. I had a question about, one of the objectives of CBAM is to catalyze more climate action. And I've read reports in the past about possibly a G7 climate club being launched at COP28, which would potentially involve the implementation of a collective CBAM across G7 member countries and even countries like Australia and Switzerland. So I guess my question for Martin is how is progress looking on this front, and do you think it's likely that we could see something like a collective CBAM? Thank you.
Yes, I think it relates a bit to a question that you had a bit earlier. I mean, it's indeed true, as far as I know, that at COP there will probably be an announcement on the climate club that was already in the media and in the discussion for a couple of years, pushed by the German government primarily, but also supported by the Commission. But this group is very important to us because it will be a forum for important exchange and discussion on decarbonization strategies, especially in relation to industrial processes. But it won't be, and it will not be for any time a discussion on a sort of club in the narrow sense of a joint zone of a carbon price with a carbon border. These are not at the moment discussions that we'll have in the G7 Climate Club. And again, I repeat the point that I made earlier, that the CBAM may become a necessity at some point for some form of economic group of countries that have agreed on the same level of carbon pricing, but it's not the ambition to multiply now CBAMs, clearly not. What we need to find is common ground on strategies that will be different for countries and regions, but some common denominator on the strategies for decarbonization, and then specifically on as I mentioned, on the methodology for accounting emissions. And then for those that opt for carbon pricing instruments, which we support very much, of course, it would be helpful to align as much as possible to help businesses complying with these different systems.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
Yeah, hi, I'm here from the Danish Embassy. I was wondering if the panel could shed some light on how CBAM will affect exporters. My understanding is CBAM is mostly targeted the importers. So it's just simply a matter of importers deselecting exporters that are less green, or do you expect to pass some of that burden to the exporters? Yeah.
Okay, so is the impact on the exporters or the importers? Let me add another question to that. I mean, to what extent do you think companies will suddenly turn around and say, blimey, it's just too difficult exporting to the EU, we'll just send our goods somewhere else in the world where they don't care so much? Who wants to go first?
I think in that sense, like I previously mentioned before, with the CBAM, it cannot be, there is always economic impact in there because there's a cost for the importers to that, and then there's a possible of reduced industrial competitiveness in there to enter the EU market, because I think most of ASEAN countries, most of developing countries, when they enter the EU market, they have some kind of agreement, like a free trade agreement between like partner economic agreement with the EU. And with this, I think CBAM can possibly hurt these advantages, and therefore there is a kind of like a disadvantage for importer in here. And but then again, as also mentioned by Martin, for countries in ASEAN, for Indonesia, for example, there's only 7% of the total export of Indonesia that is actually in the sector that is impacted by CBAM. So in terms of like the total export, it's not in terms of that, it's not that marginal in a sense, but in a short run. But then, of course, in the long run, perhaps when there's more sectors that can be impacted, these importers need to figure out a kind of like a strategy to be able to still to be able to kind of like how to how to tackle this obstacle. Yeah.
So, Martin, I mean, the original question was, is it the importer or the exporter? And if it is the exporter, the importer might deselect people. I think actually to some degree that's already happening, because companies need to be careful about where they're sourcing things from already. But perhaps you can answer.
I think also, given that this the gentleman comes from Denmark, I suppose you refer to exporters out of the union, right? Or I mean, producers based in the EU, or
so a company, say here in Southeast Asia, exporting to the EU.
Yes.
It's the person actually doing the importing, i.e. the one buying the product. They're the one that would have to do the compliance with CBAM and pay any CBAM. That was the question.
Yes. So okay. Because there is actually a completely different debate that I thought this was referring to on the difference between the free allowances that we have and the CBAM, how it affects importers and exporters in the union. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't really think. I mean, the reporting obligations and will fall, and the price to be paid will fall on the importer in the union, and then it's a question that is economic. It's an economic question, and the incidence of the charge, of the tax, of the levy, whatever of the CBAM charge is. That depends on many aspects, like market power and these kind of things, which are not necessarily the same across the various products. So that's difficult for me to judge right now. I mean, in general, when it comes to the behavioral response, that's something indeed that we need to assess. There is very little that we can build on, because there hasn't been a CBAM before, so we can build on assumptions, we can build on economic theory, but not really on evidence of actual development somewhere else in the world. But for this, it will also help that we have this gradual phase-in of CBAM and the phase-out of the free allowances from 26 onwards, where there will be a very, very slow and marginal charge applicable in 26, 27, 28. From 29 onwards, it will become a bit more biting. And so we'll see step by step, year by year, based on actual data, whether there is some behavioral response. Coming back to your question, I would be surprised if that happened, that producers would give up on the EU market, that the EU market is too big and also too too important for producers worldwide to just give up on it. But of course, you may see developments like within the supply chain to circumvent potentially the CBAM charge, and you will see actions like production destined towards the EU market and production destined to other markets, and they are a differentiation in terms of how green that production is. And these kind of things we can influence to a certain amount, but not really, because it depends then on other markets, and that's where the cooperation on pricing measures with other partners will become important, because evidently if many of these market economies like the EU have pricing mechanisms and potentially then a border adjustment, the more they have, the lesser the scope for these practices that would reduce the positive impact on climate would be.
Which brings me to a supplementary, very briefly before we close. Human beings are very clever. Whenever governments bring in a new regulation or a new charge or a new tax or mechanism, in this case, people like to find ways around it. And as supply chains are getting more and more complex in the world, I'm sure companies will get creative and try and find ways to circumvent. How are you going to measure that? How are you going to try and prevent that?
Because I'm in charge of the economic analysis team, and we will build up the risk management system. So if I knew now, then I would be happy and could go on holidays for the coming years. But that's precisely what we'll do in the next 2 years. We'll set up a system where we find. I mean, we will get a lot of information based on the CBAM reporting in the next years. We also the customs department, so we get plenty of information on the trade flows from that angle. There's global data available, and we start now to develop a system that will allow us to identify behavioral change, and some of the behavioral change is simply a legitimate and possibly desirable result of CBAM, because the purpose of CBAM is to change behavior, but we need to find ways, and I cannot tell you. I mean, I shouldn't tell you if I knew, because probably that goes live on the internet or it will be recorded. I shouldn't explain how we will track a circumvention in any case, but that will be we need to find these red flags where we see in the data that something fishy is going on, and then we will have to investigate specifically. But there, it will help that the importer is EU-based and has a liability and a sort of in EU member states, and yeah, we'll take it from there.
Okay. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our panel now. Please join me with a round of applause to thank them.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that very warm introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As has been mentioned, for the next 1 hour this afternoon, the intention is to dig deep into the intricacies of the EU CBAM, particularly in the transitional period. I think a lot of that has been alluded to by the speech by the Director General, but also the last panel that discussed generally implications of CBAM. But our panelists today have a wealth of expertise on this issue, so we'll be looking keenly to them to get further insights on, impact of CBAM for companies and how can they prepare. Gentlemen, I'd like to start by painting, or at least setting the scene for the CBAM transitional period. We've heard from the Director General and also Martin Becker before that this is essentially a period of companies reporting. Xavier, perhaps you can start us off by describing what exactly are these reporting obligations, and tied to that, how do companies prepare for those reporting obligations?
Many thanks, Marianne, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to see so much interest in this event, and indeed your interest to see how to best prepare for this transitional period. Perhaps a word on before moving to this transitional period. I mean, how to best prepare. Of course, not having in mind the end goal would be a mistake. I think in the medium to long term, decarbonisation efforts from all those industries at the pace that is consistent with the nationally determined contribution is the best way to go in the medium to long term, because the greening of production, moving to a more sustainable production, and embracing the transition would be key for all those industries. Now, indeed, we have a transitional period that has started with the last quarter of this year. The first report from importers will be due by end of January. So we have published in August the reporting requirements for this transitional period. As we have outlined already in this event, this is a transitional methodology. We will still also, based on the information we collect during this transitional period, based on the dialogue we have with partner countries, bilaterally, multilaterally, we'll still fine-tune. But I think it's important that to consider this transitional methodology as the baseline on which we will advance. So it's both a learning phase. It is there to have 2 years for all operators, EU importers, all stakeholders to adjust to those requirements. So what we have done of course, is to try as much as possible to support all businesses. We really devote a lot of our efforts nowadays to communication, outreach. We have, next to the regulation in its annex, we have produced guidance documents. These are also being translated in many foreign languages. We have also produced communication template to facilitate the exchange between exporters and the importer, because again, let me remind you that it's really the importer that will have to submit this report, but he will obviously need to get gradually more and more information from the exporter. We have produced e-learnings. We have also organized dedicated webinars per sector, so that really explain how those reporting requirements work for all of these different industries, because they can be quite different. I mean, you're talking about production processes in the cement or the steel, and that really sets out what are the boundaries of CBAM within a given plant, how to identify the relevant production processes, and how to move from measuring emissions from the operator at the plant level, which is the way we do it under the ETS, to the product level. So the methodology, it's essentially mirroring how reporting of emissions occurs in the EU for those industries under the ETS. Again, to ensure that this will be really no discrimination in terms of scope of exact emissions to be measured. It really follows the way it's done. It really follows established standards in the field. But it's of course not to minimize the difficulty. It will depend very much on the level of those equivalent or monitoring and reporting systems in the world. It is obvious that countries that have already carbon price, that have already developed monitoring and reporting systems, will better be able to adjust, because most of those requirements will be the same. They are only, this particularity is notably to adapt at first to measure a whole production at the site level, and then to allocate for given time frame over this production for given products emissions to a product level. So this is, in a nutshell, what you will find. I can only encourage all the concerned industries to have a look at our main CBAM webpage, where we retrieve all information. I think the first question is to ask yourselves, am I in scope? You will retrieve this information there based on the CN code for exports. And then from there you can find a lot of guidance document. We mentioned earlier the flexibilities. I want to remind you this because it's important. We know we're going fast. The regulation was adopted in May this year. We came up with the implementing regulation already in August. Transitional period starts in October. First report due in January. Of course, the pace is fast, and the pace goes fast because of the urgency, because we want to achieve our own decarbonisation targets in the EU. But there are flexibilities, especially in the first reporting period next year, the possibility to use default values for those that are not yet ready, or similar measurement in case they are used. But as from 25, we'll move more towards how these are set. So there's much more flexibility in the, let's say, the first year, a bit more than the first year, before moving to where there will be only 1 year left before the start of the definitive regime.
Thank you, and it's helpful that you've pointed out that there's guidance, but if I may take you back, you've explained there's reporting on emissions, but what else will companies be reporting in the transitional period?
So, but essentially what will need to be collected by an importer is it's the quantity of goods that is under the scope, the level of embedded emissions, and any carbon price that has been paid. Because also what we want to learn in this transitional phase, we of course have some views, obviously, on the existing carbon price around the world. There's different multilateral fora that also study this closely, but also potentially complexities in terms of taxes paid, because it's not necessarily under a carbon market. So we also certainly want to for any price that an exporter consider it has paid on its carbon content as transmitted, we also want to collect this. So this is in a nutshell what, the information that an EU importer, when submitting on a quarterly basis the report for the imported goods, will seek from its exporter.
Thank you. And I think with the understanding of what is expected just from the letter of the law and also what the Commission has provided in terms of guidance, probably like to turn to what's the reality on the ground. And Frank, perhaps you can take us on and sort of discuss how are companies actually responding to CBAM, and perhaps in the same breath discuss, what are some of the key challenges that are being faced by companies on both ends, so in the EU and also globally, particularly with regards to the transitional phase.
Okay, thanks. That's quite a wide question, so it could take a while. And thanks for having me on the panel. And I've never sat in a more comfortable panel chair, so stop me if I talk too long. No, it's a good question. So when I talk to companies, whether it's in Singapore, in the region, even through my colleagues in the EU, I sometimes feel I need to be multipolar. And I say this because there's a wide variety of responses that I see. And so you can, as you can imagine, right, so there's a large chunk of companies that have no idea. They might have heard of CBAM, but it's easy to underestimate how many companies actually have no idea that this is happening and it might impact them. Then there's a number of companies that they've heard of this, they don't quite know what it is, but they're pretty sure that they're not going to be impacted. That's often because they're not in the right industry, but they haven't even done their homework to make sure, am I impacted, am I not impacted? Then there's a bunch of companies that are very concerned because they're in the right industry, the wrong industry. They know they're going to be impacted, but they have no idea what to do, and they don't have the resources to figure out. And I know there's guidance published, etc., but it's all very complicated for them. And then there's a handful of companies that are kind of well in control. They have the resources, they have the understanding. Some of them, I think, overdo it a little bit, but there's only very few of those. That's certainly on the exporting side. On the importing side, it kind of mirrors that a little bit. But of course, so the vast majority of companies are still in this phase where they're not quite sure what's happening, whether it's going to impact them, and what they need to do about it. And then when you start talking to companies about, well, have a look at the regulations, have a look at what what is required of you. And this is where I get multipolar, right? When I talk to the regulators, I say, look, you got to make it easier. Companies, they just struggle with this. They don't know where to find the information, and they don't quite know how to report, and you might give a lot of guidance, they're still going to struggle. If I talk to those companies, I say, well, hang on, guys, you should go and have a look at the website. You should look at all the guidance, talk to your operations, your manufacturing operations, and get a better sense of what's happening out there. What data do you actually already have? What don't you have? So it may be a little bit less scary than perhaps at first you think, or maybe it is as scary as first you thought, but then you can start planning for it because you still have quite a long time to get your house in order. Right? And so there's this whole range of options of companies that don't know what to do, companies that don't know they're impacted, companies that already have data, but the data are different to what might be required under CBAM, and so on and so forth. And so often, and this is probably one of the biggest undertones, there's this sense that the data is out there. And it reminds me of the early FTA discussions, where I sat down with quite a few of the regulators that said, well, yeah, but the companies have all these fancy ERP systems and finance, they have all this information. Well, I'm sorry, but they don't. Or they certainly don't have it in a way that it is easy to extract. And that's when you just talk about a single company. Nowadays, a lot of the supply chain are very fragmented, certainly not very vertically integrated. And so obtaining information from suppliers or suppliers and so on and so forth, whether it's for FTAs, whether it's for labor standards, or whether it's for something like this, is extremely complicated. Commercially, there may be many, many considerations that make it very hard. And so I'm saying all of this, not to paint the picture that this is just impossible, but just it's very easy to underestimate what companies are thinking about, what they're struggling with, and how they might go about this. And so you then get to, again, a bit of a multipolar dilemma. What do? I know we have a long run-in period of companies getting used to it. Sometimes I think giving companies too long a time frame isn't necessarily very, very helpful. They like the certainty, the predictability, and therefore if you just tell them, well, this is what we expect, they might grumble, but at least they know what to do. On the other hand, I also appreciate that this is it's a first, and therefore we're testing what may or may not be possible, what the data shows us before we want to go final on what reporting is required, what actions are required. So it's a tough one. And I always think back at when I started with in my job, I was in the EU, and I'm looking at the internal market and doing an analysis of the impact of the abolition of internal controls. And there was a 7 or 8 year time period for the cross-channel ferry operators to plan for no longer being able to sell duty-free. And they had 7 years to prepare, and they were still complaining 2 months before it took effect that they didn't have enough time to prepare. So saying that this will only really bite in 2036 basically just defers the problem to 2035 or 2025 or 2025, whatever the time period is. So let me stop there. As you can see, I can go on forever. But there's a lot of granular difficulties that companies are facing, and in a moment, they don't really know.
Thank you. I think my takeaway from that discussion is that you think the future is not all too green. There's certainly solutions, and I'd be keen to discuss what light there is at the end of the tunnel. But let's maybe turn to Anbu. I'd be interested in hearing what your insights are on preparation for this transitional phase. But also, maybe let's take a glimpse into the future. It's been said that the transitional phase is a pilot. It's a pilot phase. We're preparing for the future. And I'm aware you don't have a crystal ball with you right now, but assuming you did, what would you sort of say you foresee as the challenges that companies will face once CBAM is fully implemented? Do you think there'll be any learnings from the transitional phase, or is it too early to call?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And it is an interesting, challenging, and the future is unpredictable, and I think it is a lot of uncertainties. And I'm speaking for the region and the ASEAN and East Asia. And if you look, again, the business is not a homogenic, monolithic unit, and we do have big businesses, and the businesses that is working on the global supply chain, and also the small and medium price enterprises that is very much local. And all these entities is getting affected and positively or negatively by the CBAM. I think Xavier mentioned about the procedural, and the main challenge, if I am a business operating in for example, in Indonesia, I don't have that kind of information that is what Xavier mentioned. What is the process? What is the procedural? And what is the direct or indirect impact, or what could be the perceived risks? We don't have that kind of information, so there is an information asymmetry between Brussels and in Jakarta, where the ASEAN Secretariat and this is my kind of first things, and I was involved in pre-consultation process during the COVID, and at that time we were talking about perceived kind of risk with the CBAM, and so the arguments goes like that is it is maybe here the companies believed in these NDCs that it will be based on the common but differentiated responsibility. They think that is the governments will be defending them based on the principles that may be discussed in the WTO, whether we have a conflict. But that didn't take place. But at the same time, business were moving. When we are discussing with the Brazils and basically EU Parliament, and they already organized an event in Singapore, and then it is organized one in Tokyo. They know that this is the CBAM is coming. We need to prepare for it. But the thing is, they don't know what is the decision and how they can face it. So the second challenge is the decision-making capacity, and at what level, and it exists different. And see, for example, as a part of the Glasgow and all the MNCs and most of the companies agreed to go for the net zero. And some of them has already did it, and for some of them it is an opportunity. But how far this CBAM could be utilized as an opportunity for the net zero ambitions, and that is not very clear. And so this reflects in the decision-making capacity of the company, that some of the companies are already part of the MNCs, are already part of the CDP, and this is a carbon disclosure project, and some are not. And that kind of a decision-making capacity was kind of a challenge. And the third is more about the finance, the trade and investment. And if you look into this business that is operating in this region, most of that export-oriented. And this distributional impacts of CBAM is very much felt in the first cluster of countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and which is very much these 6 sectors and very much part of it. So there is a direct impact on it. And there is a second layer of companies that is very much linked to this China, India, and then Korea and Japan. So they are not very much, but they are part of the supply chain, and there is the trade and investment limitations are there, and so it is. These countries believe in the open regionalism, where the companies has benefited from it. And now this RCEP is in force, and how far we can, this CBAM could be responsive and based on this RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement of 16 economies. And this is another of the challenge, where there is no mentioning about the CBAM and also this environmental class. And so these are the kind of 3 challenges that is I could see from the perspective of business. One is that information asymmetry. Second is this decision-making capacity at the top level and management level. And the third one is the fiscal capacity and to implement or to face the pressures that is coming from CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you, Anbu. And I think now I'd like to shift gears and sort of focus more on what I would term as carbon pricing and emission reduction strategies. But I note that there are some interesting issues that came from that discussion, and we can pick that up in the question and answer session. CBAM has been described very much as a carbon pricing mechanism and not a tax and not a trade measure. In that regard, Xavier, perhaps start us off by explaining how exactly will the existing carbon taxes that are paid abroad be taken into account? You've mentioned that in the transitional period, it's more of an informational point, but how exactly will those reported taxes be used? And then looking at the full definitive period, how exactly will those carbon taxes be taken into account in calculation of the CBAM charge?
Is this on? Yes, it's on. So the regulation ensures that any effective carbon price paid will be deducted when times come as from the definitive regime. So we have in mind, and as it is defined in the regulation, carbon pricing like ETS, like market-based instruments, but also carbon taxes, as long as they're really based on carbon content. And this price should be effectively be paid, so not rebated in any way, including not through free allocation of free allowances, for example, under an ETS, or if it's a tax, not rebated on the export, for example. It needs to be effectively, carried by the exporters, and so that it would be deducted. Of course, we'll still refine exactly what is the methodology. This is also part of what we still have to produce before the start of the definitive period. How to appoint this carbon price based to a given share of the production that is exported and things like that. But in a nutshell, this is what we have. And as mentioned earlier, we'll still collecting also through this transitional period to see exactly how we'll fix the exact boundaries of those prices. But it's a bit too early to say. Perhaps I can take the opportunity to come back to and to pick up on the discussion we just had on what the operators know and what we know, what we don't know. I think it links back a bit to the previous sessions on impact. If you look for the Asian countries, at this stage, we look at the latest trade statistic. Indeed, the ones that are most exposed are Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand to a lesser extent, and essentially in the steel industry. For a total of about 3 million tons of exported steel every year, if we take 22 as a reference. And this is, of course, from our perspective, from the perspective of EU imports, this is a rather small share out of a total of 76 million tons. So our main trading partners in the steel are our neighbors, and actually before we imposed sanctions on Russia, it was Russia the biggest exporter of steel, and you see those shares picking up a bit everywhere. And it's also the case, for example, probably in Indonesia, also in 22, with quite a strong increase. But then the question is what we know and what we don't know about who will be impacted. What we know, or think we know, is that, of course, CBAM is predominantly about heavy industries, energy-intensive industries, in sectors with large economies of scale, with very large groups overall. And you can almost count those sites all over the world where those plants are located. So that is an information that we have. And from our experience, those groups, and certainly the ones we had the opportunity to engage with, many are well aware. They know what is coming. They are already, as we speak, very much advanced, and we are discussing on the nitty-gritty with them. They are aware and they are focused. what is more difficult is where there are more unknowns, and we very much agree on that, is throughout the supply chain, in more downstream products. You can have, although they are responsible for a smaller share of emissions, you have potentially more SMEs. So, for example, in some of the downstream products, we had recently discussions also with partners in Korea or Japan. You have producers of nuts, bolts, and the small items which are typically using steel from potentially sourced from the same country, but it could get more complex, and we don't have at this stage a lot of information on how many will be impacted, to what extent they will manage, and I'm sure indeed that at this stage most of them still have to even realize they may have to report something. I think for this, I think the level of engagement, although at all level we'll do everything we can, but for ensuring an effective outreach, I think the sectors in those countries, any government agency, if they can provide support, I think it would be very useful. But in any case, even if there's an asymmetry of information and we don't have, we may think we know or we don't, or we just don't have the information, this is also precisely why we have this transitional period. And I think especially because of this, I think although it's not stable yet, as Frank said, that's perhaps a downside. But I think collecting the information and realizing to what extent we have gaps, we'll have gaps for sure. But this will already be information to what extent all the supply chains will be ready in time. What do we need to adjust? Do we need to adjust flexibilities also to cater for this? Will be important. And then finally, I think as part of the review we also hopefully have more views on where the EU should provide more support for capacity building for the most exposed countries and sectors. We mentioned the large amounts that are dedicated to the transition in third countries, but it's certainly from the European Commission perspective, an appetite for channeling more for direct support in support of the application of CBAM. So there also this information would be very useful. So this is all your question on carbon price, but I wanted to just quickly come back on the first round. Thank you.
Thank you. I think as we sort of gathered from the initial discussion, the issue of information asymmetry is a key item. It's a hot topic to discuss. It sounds to me that there's gaps on the Commission side, but there's also gaps on our industry side. So there's a bit of bridging that needs to happen on both ends. Just taking us back to the carbon pricing discussions, Xavier mentioned capacity building. Frank, I wanted to maybe ask you to take us through, it seems to me that companies can reduce the cost or the implications of CBAM if they have lower emissions. Question is, how do they get there? How do they sort of pull themselves to innovating and reducing emissions? And what sort of support are a company sort of looking to get as they work towards emission reduction strategies?
Okay. Interesting. Let's link it to the previous points, right? So first of all, you can name something many things, but I think we should refer to it as a tax. Whether we like it or not, it's money that's collected from business that goes into government coffers. Trying to name it something else just creates unnecessary confusion, I think. The other thing, coming back that also on your point, we talk around, well, who's most affected? Is it or in ASEAN, there's not so many countries. In the EU's own rhetoric, it says, no, it's a measure on companies, not on countries. And we heard the DG this morning also talk about, well, it's just a small percentage of trade that's impacted. The reality is, if you're a business that's impacted, even if you're 0.1% of trade, it's 100% of your business. And you can't give those businesses, particularly of their SMEs, but also the larger businesses, a message that, well, we don't really care so much about you because you're just a small portion. Because every single business is only a very small portion of overall trade. And because if that's the message around CBAM, then well, what is the message around telecoms or you name it, e-commerce, whatever it might be. So every company in its own right matters 100%. Now then, what do companies do? How can they prepare to deal with this CBAM? Well, I think your question in a way is a little bit loaded because it only looks at, well, how can they get more, if you like, climate friendly, environmental friendly? That, in a way, whether you like it or not, that's only one option. Right? There are also options of companies to say, well, actually, nobody in my industry or in my products knows what to do, is actually has the ability to really respond to this. So we're just going to pay that charge. We have no option, and the buyers in Europe may have no other way of sourcing. So that is an option. There are exporters, and we heard that in I think Chris was asking the question in the earlier panel, that say, well, if selling to the EU is very hard, then maybe we sell somewhere else. That's another option. Now, ultimately, I would like to think, don't take me for a non-environmentalist. I'd like to see companies take actions that would make them more environmentally friendly. I'm not sure whether CBAM will have that immediate impact. It's one step of perhaps 1 million steps that are needed to really achieve that. And so with that in mind, I think, so companies do then need to support. We had a question earlier about carrot versus stick. I'm never a big fan of pure carrots because I think it makes companies lazy. They just get some money for it and then I don't have to do anything. But I do think, the support to say, well, how can you actually change your behavior so that this won't be as impactful? And you can still sell to your buyers in the EU without having this potential charge hanging over your head. I think that is important. And that, I think, at the moment is just not really discussed as much. I think it's very hard for the regulators to understand. It's very difficult for an organization to make points that go beyond what is relevant to themselves. Just one company. And trying to get a whole industry together is very difficult because even players in the same industry will have very different trade flow footprints. So they have very different ideas. They have very different IT systems, for example, to make things happen. They have very different products that they need to worry about. But so this is where I think the expert groups that are being set up to discuss these things are absolutely crucial, because otherwise there's a real risk that companies will try and just, as most companies do, they have shareholders and stakeholders to please. They will take the route that is least resistant, most cost efficient, which may not necessarily be the route that is best for the environment.
Thank you. That's an interesting insight. And thank you for sort of broadening that discussion to focus more on, just looking beyond reducing emissions and how to best comply. Anbu, perhaps you would have some remarks. I think the comment that has been made often is that exports from the ASEAN region are very marginal, so in any case the impact would be limited. As you respond to that, maybe take us through what you think ASEAN businesses can do to adapt to the implementation of CBAM and sort of position themselves in a more competitive way in sort of the ever increasingly carbon conscious international market.
We are doing a study and basically it is a simulation analysis and how far the competitiveness of ASEAN industries will be on the CBAM and we found the preliminary results are available. We are rerunning the models and what could be the range of the carbon CBAM price and its effectiveness or the impact on the. We find some of the figures that is really disturbing and there are some losers and there are winners, I think, in the overall and within these 10 countries. And the challenge here is and if there are losers and how they can be take that risk and there are two opportunities that is we found we are still digging out and one thing is they need to improve the efficiency, carbon efficiency and the opportunity here is we disaggregated where are the opportunities. One is that is export. I think that most of them are coming from the technical side, improving your production process and how you are making the product and services made available. And the second thing is the trade and investment, how you get that investment that could be channelized and towards improving the carbon productivity. And third one is the trade facilitation. That is how you can use current FTAs that is available and to improve your carbon productivity. And so this is very much linked to how much the price that is the CBAM will be putting in. It is the kind of this is things that is we are working on. There are opportunities, and but our thinking is. The businesses cannot effectively, given the current situation, cannot effectively inherit or address this full implementation of the CBAM. It needs a public and private partnership. I think they need a support, they need from the governments. And what form this support can happen, and we don't know, because the governments are in dilemma. We coming to this ASEAN plus 6 countries, they have the dilemma whether to go for direct carbon taxes or go for an ETS as implemented in things. They have a dilemma whether ETS will work or whether this voluntary carbon market will work. They have a dilemma how this voluntary carbon market will take into accommodate this CBAM. So there is a full puzzles and we need to be unlocked, and that need further discussion and elaboration. And given that puzzle and here the complexity is this region is not a part of a simple export and import. Most of the business operating here is a part of a production network, basically where the product and your production process moves across the gross boundaries. And for example, Malaysia to Singapore and Singapore to Thailand. And in this regard, and how we can enhance and how can fully adapt this shocks that is coming from the CBAM. That need to be internalized, and that we need a kind of a mechanism that need more capacity building. And second complexity comes in that is related to maybe EU side, and for example, the revenue that is generated from the CBAM, whether it could be revenue recycled to help these industries to become a competitiveness, or they can embrace the full adaptation. And there are several examples that exist. And for example, in Germany and during the 1997 financial crisis, and Germany has a kind of debt swap program where basically they helped the SMEs to improve the energy efficiency. Whether that kind of mechanism and that kind of new revenue that is generated from the CBAM could be channelized to improve some of the losses, and that could be one thing that is we can think about it. And my last point here is about the carbon consciousness and of the international market. And of course, I think this shows that is the countries that is the companies in this region need to become more competitive. But at the same time, ASEAN is different from EU. And if you look into the companies, and we are talking, we are putting, I think DG has mentioned, CBAM is a climate policy. This is an instrument that can avoid the leakage of carbon from Europe to the rest of the world. But if you look into this region, the companies, of course, the carbon efficiency is an important, and that is very much related to their competitiveness. But at the same time, they also have the challenges in tackling this is the second generation of the environmental problems like water pollution and air pollution. So how this CBAM can help to identify the core benefits of the climate change mitigation, the carbon leakage. There are technologies that is available that can bring the carbon leakages. And third one is also most of the companies that is operating and in this region and still has the kind of obligation of the corporate social responsibility. And particularly the SMEs are very much fabric of the social development. So most of the people, and nearly 30% of the people are still under the poverty line. And so the companies also has the social responsibility. And so how they can deal, this CBAM can be an instrument to challenge the core benefits and also bring the social cohesion or social integrity. If it won't, then this full implementation of the CBAM is possible, and it will be embraced by the businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. Sort of picking up on two things that you said. One on competitiveness. We've sort of heard about the ASEAN side, and I'm interested on the EU side. I think CBAM has sort of been touted as the measure that will level the playing field for EU producers that are already subject to stringent carbon pricing measures. Xavier, could you maybe elaborate on how CBAM contributes to that, leveling the playing field and relatedly reducing carbon leakage, which is, I think, a term that is often used, but I'm not sure we all understand what exactly it means.
Well, I would rather use the word ensuring to pay a fair price, because the way CBAM has been conceived is really in complement to the EU ETS, as we outlined a bit in previously. So I think and also coming back on this incentives that we mentioned for decarbonisation, I think it's important to stress that the major the first objectives of the measures to ensure the EU reaches its own objective, because this incentive, this level of price that will be faced by companies in the EU will be for the whole of their production. And this is to ensure that the EU has the highest possible ambitions for climate change and reaches effectively its target already by 2030, and then to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So we had a system where again, we had the system in place, but those industries were not really facing the full price, far from it, because of those free allowances. So basically, as we will be gradually removing those allowances, that was not really mentioned before, so I think it's important to stress that as from 26, CBAM will be introduced only to the extent those free allowances are removed. And it's not going to be linear. So the first years, the share of the acceleration of the removal of those free allowances will be limited, and then it will reach 100% by 2034. But by 2030, only about half, 48.5 to be precise, of those free allowances will be removed. So, and of course, any price due on the emissions on embedded emissions on imports will only be proportional. So it's really a gradual introduction, but really the incentives is on the EU industry side, because they will gradually face like a price of 100 euros per ton of equivalent CO2 emissions. And this is something that is quite radical. So there's of course we have there's always discussion in the literature how we can measure carbon leakage. Is that a proven phenomena and so on? Here, I think it's important to stress this, as has been done also by DG Thomas in his speech, that we are going to really accelerate to tremendously, and it will put a tremendous effort required on EU industries. So the instruments, to come back to your question, is only there. I mean, at least its primary objectives to ensure that all industries will reach their objective, and that is not undermined by carbon leakage. And as a secondary objective that is linked, of course, is to promote greener transitions also elsewhere, to make sure that our imports are as green as our production will be. But I think it's important to and it's often overlooked. This primary objective that CBAM should not be seen in isolation to the efforts under the ETS, and so I think that's the main mechanism for ensuring that a fair price is paid and it's equivalent both for EU production as for the share that is imported in the EU.
Thank you, Frank. I'm wondering whether, Anbu, you might have any thoughts or any remarks in response to this, dichotomization of the objectives, the primary objective being environmental considerations and the secondary objective was, or at least the outcome being, leveling or making the price a bit fair for European industries. Do you have any thoughts on that, sort of coming from exporting producers looking into the European market? Go ahead if you also have. Go ahead.
No, I mean, some interesting points. Also going back to your previous the previous question about it's the large companies that you talk to. They know their impact and they kind of know what to do. But there is swathes of thousands of smaller, like the nuts and bolts companies. That are going to be impacted, and how are they going to manage? Because they may not necessarily have the resources or the ability to deal with this. And ultimately, if the environment is the ultimate goal, and therefore you'd say, well, any policy would really, if it was, at the moment you do it only on a subsector of industry or business, you'll create room for arbitrage. So ultimately, you'd say, well, if you wanted to make it really fair, everybody who was importing a unit of pollution would have to pay the same price. Now, I'm glad I'm not a regulator because that's impossible to regulate. But thinking about, well, how are companies going to respond? Like, an analogy perhaps is, many of you are in Singapore. So why do you put speed cameras on the road? Well, you want to make traffic safer. Do speed cameras make traffic safer? Well, it really depends. Like when you drive on the road here, you'll see people screech to a halt in front of a camera and change lanes and stuff. So I don't think that actually achieves the objective. But and maybe there's too few of them. So there's always going to be some externalities. And so I was thinking, a very simple example that sprang to mind. And I'm not an industry expert, but just think about aluminium foil, which everybody will know. And as far as I understand, there's two ways of making aluminium foil. One is that you take a sheet of paper and you spray aluminium onto it. And that gives you aluminium foil. The other one, you actually make it from aluminium and use some kind of adhesive coagulant that creates a sheet. Now, in customs terms, the first one is classified as a paper product. The second one is classified as an aluminium product. So the first one is not captured by CBAM. The second one is. Now, immediately you have some arbitrage. Not just arbitrage, also if you're in the industry and saying, well, somebody else is making it this way, now I'm going to be out of business because I can't compete anymore. I don't even know which of these two production methods is more or less environmentally friendly. But if you're in business, these are the questions you're going to have to address. And so no matter how tiny this is in the grander scheme of things, individual companies are going to have to look at their product mix, their competitors, and say, well, okay, how do I respond to this? And so even if they're saying, well, I want to do the right thing, and I want to do better in creating a production method that's most environmentally friendly, that might mean they're out of business. And that's a very difficult thing to address. And again, that's coming back to the expert panels and understanding how the industries work to try. Because if you then say, well, okay, once you see the trade diversion effects, the EU Commission might say, oh, actually, we also got to add aluminium-backed paper to the list. So you catch out the people that are doing this because it's not very environmentally friendly. Well, that then goes to the heart of, well, how do I plan for my business for the next 5 to 10 years? Like if I do something that seems okay now, but this is a moving target. Right? And so these, they're not easy questions to answer, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. But we can't ignore them.
Thanks, Frank. Curious to hear from Xavier at some point whether it's an ongoing process of adding more products to the list depending on circumvention or circumvention practices of companies. Anbu, do you have any thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, I think I think EU strategy is progressive and modular, and I think that is a good approach. And if you go back to 3 years back during the COVID, and when EU's Green Deal was formulated, and it is looking at this decarbonisation and then circular economy and the digital economy. And I think we and the ASEAN also, we have a kind of a similar framework, ASEAN Comprehensive Economic Framework, that have these 3 pillars, and then plus social integrity and health. And so I think this approach is modular, and they have the transition and then implementation, and from that learning then we can go and expand. I'm seeing from that approach, from the perspective of ASEAN, which is an export-oriented economy. Almost all of them are in the global chain, and they get benefited it, and we moved from the poverty to prosperity. But I feel that is basically the business, from the business perspective, and it cannot be a simple climate strategy. And when the next wave of CBAM comes in, and they need to prepare for a kind of an integrated strategy, that is a competitive strategy. That cannot be a simple energy strategy and energy efficiency improvement or the carbon only. They need to look into that innovation, and that is how far learning from this previous phase of this implementation, and how far the countries can prepare for that innovation. Second thing is also the competitiveness, and I agree with Frank, and business are smart, and their product and their services doesn't have the emotions. It will go wherever the market is. And if Europe is becoming very, very costly and of doing business, and they can find much cheaper places wherever the market exists. And it is then they can go to US or even now, not only now ASEAN is not only exporting for Europe or the Western Hemisphere, and they are also consuming more. And so this kind of an integrated strategy of energy and environmental and then innovation policy will be a kind of a strategy they need to look for it in the overall improving the competitiveness. Otherwise, most of these industries will fall, and they will be preying into these domestic markets, which is still not carbon conscious.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the last potential issue that I foresee, I think it was mentioned before that CBAM is not the only reporting mechanism that exists. And that begs the question, and perhaps Frank, you could help us address that, is, does CBAM complicate the existing, does it complicate the landscape of reporting mechanisms that already exist? And if it does, how can companies synthesize this whole process? Like, how can they ensure that you build systems internally that are not just for compliance with CBAM, but anything else that comes in between?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because clearly here we are talking about CBAM, and the audience, the panelists, etc. For them, CBAM is an important matter and something that needs to be addressed. If you're running a company, this is just one of a myriad of things that you have to do. You have financial reporting and accounting and dealing with artificial intelligence and labor reporting and whatever it might be. And there's a lot of stuff going on. So this is just one extra thing on top of lots of other reporting requirements. Now, how you actually then go about measuring or calculating the statistics that you have to report, how you integrate it into your systems, they're all complex questions. And when you look at it purely in isolation, and we heard the DG talk about this a little bit, all of this can be addressed. Yes, of course it can be addressed. But when you put it within another 50 things that have to be addressed, it becomes more complicated. You know, anybody who works for a large company that has an IT department will know that if you go to your IT department and say, well, we need to put some extra forms in and some extra processes to report on this, they'll kind of go, oh, that'll take 3 man-years and 5 years to implement. It'll cost you $10 million. You know, I exaggerate, but I mean, there's a lot of these practical questions, so it doesn't naturally, it does make things more complex. Again, it's easy to underestimate, or it's easy to underestimate how complex if you look at it in isolation. Right? The other thing, of course, and this comes back to the point, it's a moving landscape. So if you're going to spend a lot of time on a process or on something, do I put in place measuring equipment at my factory? Or do I put in place spreadsheets or technology that does the calculation, only to find that 6 months or a year later, the landscape changes. So now you've invested in something that's no longer worthwhile. So that is very difficult for companies, and even the larger companies struggle with this, although they have bigger resources and perhaps they have more people to kind of talk to the regulators and know where the landscape is moving to. If you're a smaller company, you just take whatever you get given in terms of regulations. And that's what I have as a concern, to say a lot of those companies are going to say, well, let's just sit back and wait until really we have no other choice but to do something. But by then, hopefully, we have lots of examples as to how we should be doing this.
Thank you. Xavier, I'm wondering whether in response to that you can maybe elaborate a little bit, probably out of your docket, but is there anything on the Commission side that's, is there any initiative to work towards streamlining reporting obligations under different EU measures or regulations?
I mean, we do recognize there's a compliance cost associated to CBAM. This was already clearly outlined when the Commission made a proposal as part of its impact assessment. So we know there's a compliance cost that it's linked to it. We do hope it is mostly, and we have in mind especially, again, the very large companies that are running the major sites in the steel industry, in the cement industry. These are not overall small players. That this will represent also more a one-off cost to adjust, because once you have adopted the system, then running it from 1 year to another will be easier. It will be yearly reports, but it's done ex post. So there's nothing stopping trade. There's nothing stopping the exports. It's the information that will have to be ultimately submitted every year, verified. A lot will be also directly shared and set in our registry, so that for those really producing the steel and like intermediary products, this should be much. I mean, this should be possible to handle. For the smaller companies, we have set some flexibilities because we know they do not represent a large share of emissions. So we have given the possibility to only use default values. What is important is to capture the emissions from the larger emitter. And in the case where you are concerned by you're more in the downstream, to have this information. But again, there you have information. I think delaying the adaptation, understand the business logic, but I think it's important to gradually move towards compliance. Again, there's this transitional period of a bit more than 2 years is gradual, also in the type of requirements that will apply from just using default values, estimates, and then ultimately moving towards complying with these transitional requirements. We will take stock by 2025 based on the information received. This will also, to come back to your earlier questions, link to there will be also, after the introduction of CBAM, regular reporting on risk of circumvention. But of course, this risk of circumvention, if you talk to EU industries, they will be particularly worried that there's any way to circumvent CBAM. So we are monitoring this, but any extension to further downstream products have to be balanced also with what it means in terms of impact and how manageable it will be for obtaining this information in those value chains. So the feasibility will be an important criteria, both for the scope, as mentioned earlier, in priority or analysis for the petrochemical sector, but also further extension to downstream products will may be done, but very carefully. So indeed, if the process that you mentioned, and I'm not so aware of, based on those CN codes, will lead to suddenly a surge of imports in our, it will show up. And if so, I mean, will come the questions of what we will do. But of course, I mean, we're using CN codes are mostly made for collecting to assign tariffs. We are using what we have based on our on what exists in this nomenclature that we use for customs. It is true that I mean it's a question upon how detailed they are. In some of the products, are we mixing too much? But I mean, at this stage, we need to work with this, and I think they can be fairly efficient. But this is something that they will for sure monitor.
Thank you. I'd like to come back later to get your parting shots and final remarks. But before that, maybe let's bring a close to the formal discussion amongst the panelists and invite other voices to the discussion. So I'm looking to the audience to sort of see if there are any questions directed to the panelists on this very key issue. I think there's one question over there.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting afternoon. I have two questions. One is maybe a bit basic, but we've been talking about carbon all the time. What standard are we using to measure carbon? Is there a common standard, or is it going to be based on the standard that the EU has developed or Singapore has for our carbon tax? And if there's no common standard, are we moving towards a common standard? The next question is on your issue of capacity building. So I noticed that now the products that are under steel, aluminium, which is a lot of energy required to produce steel and aluminium because they are the blast furnace and all that. But as we move down into the secondary products like your nuts and bolts, your precision engineering, a lot of will be dependent on the energy emissions by the electricity supplier for that country. So have you thought about how we are going to segue and look into that? And is the EU prepared then to give capacity building to these countries so that they can improve their clean energy electricity source? Thank you.
Thank you. Xavier, I think it would be safe to say that those questions are directed towards you.
Okay, many thanks for your question. So in terms of standards, I think if you look at how emissions are measured at the plant level, at the operator level, there are a number of fairly well-established standards, although they may slightly differ. The reporting requirements, the transitional reporting requirements, are essentially mirroring how emissions are measured under the EU ETS. But this is also to ensure that there's no discrimination between the way an EU industry will pay a carbon price on its emissions and compared to imports. But in terms of how these are measured, well, it's a question of, so the scope maybe is defined in our methods. It is we have to define in a given plan the relevant production process, the boundaries. So there's one I mentioned earlier, sort of one-off exercise to look at those production process and think, okay, what is in line, what is in scope of CBAM. Then in terms of calculating those emissions, there are different possibilities that are allowed and possible, be it based on mass balances or it's actually a calculation approach. This gets a bit technical, but there are different options that are well established. What is not common in the standard is, of course, to go to the product level. There it is quite clear that with CBAM, the EU has moved towards a step that is not common because of focused on essentially scope 1 emission, and I will come to your second question in a moment. So we're moving ahead with this to be able to achieve our objectives in the EU, but this can be discussed again. We certainly do not want to prevent discussion at the international level to move towards standards. There will certainly be possible synergies, but this will take time, certainly. So this is something that the EU wants to encourage, the discussion on carbon pricing, the discussion on how to establish more common methodologies. And we cited earlier the work in different fora, including the OECD. But at this point in time, and given the urgency of achieving our target, which are already in 2030, we are advancing based on our approach. Again, building the step towards putting it to the product level is fairly simple, and the essential part is based on the site level, on the plant level, if you like. On your second question, so it's important to stress, and thank you for your question because we may not have stressed that sufficiently earlier, is that scope 2 emissions, so emissions related to electricity, are not so far included in CBAM for steel and aluminium. However, we do ask to report on those emissions in the transitional period, because it's also based on this information that we will take stock again in 25 to decide whether the scope should be extended to those emissions. So emissions linked to the electricity used in aluminium or the steel industry. The reason why it's not included so far, it's because in the EU, several member states give support to their industries. So there's a mechanism called indirect cost compensation for their electricity they use. So it's an instrument, I mean, it's a subsidy given so that to cater for the price they pay on the carbon price they paid for the electricity generated in the EU, which pays a carbon price. So it's a sort of, it's also it's more limited, but it's still also a protection for carbon leakage. So should it be extended, of course, it will have to come with the end of that system, and it's not included precisely to make sure there's no discrimination. Had we included it, that's while some member states do give subsidies, state aid to their producer, that would have not been the fair system that we wanted to design. So scope 2 are not yet included for that purpose. We do, however, start to give, I mean, the capacity building does exist in those fields. I can cite, for example, the case of Zimbabwe, which has a large, it's Mozambique, sorry, Zimbabwe also, but Mozambique has a very large aluminium industry. And there are EU projects on the ground to decarbonize the electricity used in the production process. So again, I think capacity building, it's something that this is not directly our services, but within the European Commission, we are very attentive to that, to channel also support in a more targeted way, also taking into account that we are rolling out this instrument.
Thank you. Yes, let's have remarks.
Some regional perspective on this question, and to supplement what Xavier mentioned. One thing is the carbon accounting methodologies. And for these 6 sectors, basically they are established. There is based on the UNFCCC framework conditions. So there is a standard methodologies that is established, but what the difficulty is and to finding a price discovery. And if you know that is how much is emitting, but how it could be translated into a carbon price, that is where that is a gap exists. And the second question on the electricity utilities, and the challenge here is a little bit different, that need a capacity building. And here if you look into this region, and energy is generated and then it is distributed. And here, except Singapore, I think most of this generation and the distribution is held by the state-owned enterprises. Again, they are subsidized. And how you internalize the external cost, that is a difficult, that need a kind of a political will. Not only sharing this kind of a technical capacity building, but also sharing the good practices is also an important in there. And third thing is, I would like to emphasize, and in these 6 sectors, that is where EU has identified for this CBAM introduction, and the companies, they know that is what is their carbon inventory, and they also made efforts in a progressive and based on the sectoral initiatives that is relatively fast and it is a low hanging. But one thing is, whatever that comes, including CBAM, will be a kind of an exercise which will be a costly, and whatever they are doing. And we also need to be closely monitor and how this price, this is a new price, will be transferred. Basically, the companies transfer their prices, additional cost to the consumers, and which will be that eventually paying. And basically, we also need to, maybe you need to consider how the consumers from this region, how far they are willing to pay for it. And that may be one dimension, and think we need to look into it. Thank you.
Thanks. And maybe just one additional comment from what I see from a company perspective. Clearly, ultimately, your question is, it's in the name, carbon, right? So as long as there's carbon going into the atmosphere, and that's measurable. Every time I breathe out, I emit some carbon. If I exercise, it's good for me, it's bad for the environment. But what I don't like is you see companies that I think they're kind of hiding behind, oh, how do we measure, what do we measure? Again, I think they don't help the discussion, because they're just trying to find difficulties where there shouldn't be any, because the measurement of the emissions is relatively well established, as the other panelists have said. Where it can get a little complicated, and again, maybe a simple example would be best. Let's say you're a Vietnamese maker of steel pipes, and you sell all of these in ASEAN. And now suddenly you get an order from a company in Germany to say, hey, we urgently need some steel pipes. Now you have a marginal additional production. So how do you now, what is the additional emissions that you create because you're already running a fully fledged factory? And we see this in other areas, whether it's allocation of overheads for FTAs and for audit purposes as well, statutory audit purposes. That's where I think it could become a little bit trickier. And we haven't talked about this at all yet, is saying, well, how do you document that? How do you report it? Because when the verifiers come 2 years down the line, are they going to agree with you as to how you've done that? And so that's where I can see some complexities come in. But the basic measurement shouldn't be that much of a difficulty.
Thank you. I would like to, see if there are further questions, but I think we're close to the top of the hour. Yes, we have one final question. Please go ahead.
Very much. Vivian Liu from Climate Smart Investments and Philanthropy Works. So, first of all, thank you to each panelist. I think the invaluable perspectives from, complementary angles. The question that I have for Venkatachalam and Frank is, are companies in the region assuming that the EU would likely be the only region applying CBAM for the foreseeable future? Because there's discussion on how, you can supply to China and essentially the rest of the world. essentially not having to deal with CBAM. So the context is that in 2018, in the first advisory report for GIC, which is one of our sovereign wealth funds, we predicted a policy much like CBAM, of course not with that name, given the likely state of how the climate crisis would unfold, policy responses, and so on. And so the expectations of how different jurisdictions will respond going forward in the next even 3 to 5 years, but certainly in the next 5 to 10, that is essential in determining the correct strategic response by corporations in Asia to CBAM. If I may, a second question, which is more on the implementation side. What is your sense as to how much lead time is, let's say, necessary, or what's the range of preparatory period for companies in APEC, and especially those in ASEAN, to be able to meet the standards of CBAM properly? So that will give, the companies in the segment that is most affected at this point an assessment as to essentially the drop dead time. Let me rephrase that, my apologies. The time to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank, do you want to take?
I'm happy to go
ahead.
first. And I think a very good question. I'd say, coming back to my earliest comment, I don't think companies are assuming anything. I think a lot of companies are not really seriously thinking enough about this. But maybe, again, I like using examples, as you would have figured out. Let me give you an example of Mandarin oranges. You might think, well, how does that apply? Well, when the Trump administration, first Trump administration, started with its punitive tariffs, there was a company I was working for that was sourcing Mandarin oranges out of China. And they were hit by punitive tariffs. So that company said, okay, we got to find somewhere else. And they found somewhere in Mediterranean Europe to source their Mandarin oranges. And then there was a dispute between the US and the EU. And although there was nothing to do with Mandarin oranges, they were called out as punitive tariffs. And then so that company said, well, where do we go next? So they went to Southern Africa. You might have read the news that about a month ago, there was a big change to the US's unilateral preferential regime versus African countries. So companies like that, and there's many of them, say, well, there's no point trying to speculate. We have to deal with what we have today. And whether or not China or Australia or the US or Turkey, whoever else it is going to put in place a CBAM, we just can't speculate on that. They will do some what-if analysis. Now, one of the things, again, looking back at the what is generally called the US-China trade war, but it's much wider than that. The discussions I had with a lot of companies say, well, what are you doing to prepare? Are you doing scenario analysis, what-ifs, etc.? I thought it was quite striking how little companies did, even the large multinationals. And part of the reason for that is there's so many variables that it's virtually impossible. They feel it's kind of a waste of time to go into too much detail. And that comes back to your second question then. Well, the longer your time horizon, the harder it is to predict. So a lot of companies really, they're looking for certainty, but also know, well, the certainty that I'm going to get is probably only going to be 2 or 3 reporting periods away. And that's how a strategy is built, or at least whether it's right or wrong is up for strategy advisors to discuss. But they focus more on the short term that is more predictable. And so I think that's what we would see with CBAM as well. For now, you're going to have to deal with EU CBAM, and let's deal with that. And then if somebody else follows suit, if your response to EU CBAM is to become greener and therefore protect your access, then you're probably well positioned to deal with future measures in other territories. If your response is, well, I'm no longer going to sell to the EU, I'm going to sell to China or somewhere in the region or somewhere in Africa, and those territories are then starting with their own CBAM, well, okay, then you're running behind companies that have taken a different approach. Now, who's going to win that battle in the short and the long term is, at this stage, I think, just entirely unpredictable. But that's an individual company perspective, perhaps.
Thank you. And it is a complex question, and there is no simple answers. But one thing is, the basic thing is how ASEAN business can prepare, and for this global movements are coming from in the form of CBAM. And if you look into these gravity centers of this CBAM are made, there are three. And one is that is Europe, and I think which is very much idealistic in going for the green, and they already introduced the ETS, and then they wanted to avoid the carbon leakages, and then it comes in. It is a very idealistic, and it is also justifiable, and it is a natural. And the second gravity center is in US, and which believes in the markets, and like emission trading systems and will work, and they gave it to the private sector. And the third gravity center is in emerging experiences from East Asia, like China, Japan, and Korea. They are already experimented that ETS systems. So basically so far, if you look into the ASEAN business and the ASEAN governments, they don't have their own strategy and to invent, to experiment. Basically, they are surfing any of these three gravity centers. So here the thing is how there is a kind of emerging, now ASEAN is working on this climate neutral strategy, and then previously they have the kind of green taxonomy or the sustainable financing strategy. Maybe we need to look into this ASEAN business, and we need to develop our own kind of an strategy to address rather than surfing and reacting to these things. Then we will be in a more a defendable position. And second thing is what could be the practical actions, and I think one is the internal, that companies need to think about it. The bottom line is the competitiveness, and we need to be competitive. And to be competitive, and this carbon auditing and this developing the carbon inventory of your activities will help you. So reacting to this CBAM will need to be internalized, and so that is your business practices could be changed, and it will help you in improving your competitiveness. And second thing is how this strategy, this internal strategy, could be used to liberalize and or to leverage this investment strategy. And most of ASEAN businesses, we need a technology and we need a finance. And this could be coming from FDIs, and it could be supported by ODA. And how this FDI and this ODA mechanism that is coming from Europe could be leveraged and synergized if you take this internal, this first homework, that is developing the carbon inventory and improving your competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. I realize that we could go on this subject, but this obviously has to come to a close. Also, would hate to be the bottleneck between your and the networking reception that's about to happen. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights. Appreciate your time and your contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our second panel. Thank you so much for your attention.